Welcome to the Steelers Breakdown podcast featuring PennLive Steelers beat reporter Nick Farabaugh, who was out with Farabaugh 1.0, his mock draft, a 7-rounder in which he lines up the Steelers' needs with the observations he made down at the Senior Bowl to see who they will actually select. It's based on a lot of his analysis, and we're going to get to it right away. But first, we got to go talk about this Palace intrigue in Pittsburgh that may hold a clue for why the Steelers' offense seemed sabotaged down the stretch. And I'm talking about the report out by Steelers insider Jerry Dulac, where he talks about a blow up between Russell Wilson and Arthur Smith that culminated with Wilson's best game against Cincinnati in Week 13, where he poured on the passing yards and piled up the points. It was the high point of the season, certainly for Wilson, and it brought him, to like a 6-1 mark, I think, at the time. Everything looked great, but apparently Smith, behind the scenes, didn't like it, because Wilson was audibling at the line of scrimmage, changing plays, preferring to pass down the field instead of stick to the ground game, which never really did, produce any thunder this past season. Yet Smith was adamant. He shut Wilson down from having that power to change the plays. And the result was that 6-game slide right through the playoffs and one and done again, in which the Pittsburgh offense was absolutely putrid, like 17 points a game or something like that. It was a terrible average. But this is a pretty damning report. It's definitely favorable to Wilson, and sort of explains why he faltered down the stretch, and sort of buoys the part of the, I guess there's a wing inside the Steelers organization that wants to sign him. And this is almost refuting that negative report that came out last week by the ESPN reporter that said Wilson was looking terrible in practice. That was kind of a damning report to Wilson. This is almost like a rebuttal, and it seems like it's both sides are leaking here. So what's going on? I mean, with the report itself, but also the leaks as one or two of the, only one of these quarterbacks, Justin Fields or Russell Wilson, is going to get a contact with the Steelers. So now you're having these dueling leaks. One was really damning against Wilson, and now this is kind of pro Wilson, because it's saying, hey, he was almost sabotaged by Smith, and that led to his poor production. So what do you make? How do you analyze something like this, and what's going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, he said, she said, et cetera, et cetera. This is what happens in contract talks. And so every time one of these things comes out, you got to ask who benefits from it. And there's a lot of nuance in pre-snap stuff, guys. There's a lot of nuance. What freedom did Russ have before it was taken away? Was it now he can't change blitz calls? Can he not change protections? Can he not change route stems? Can he not change routes themselves? I'll tell you what, I saw him canning plays far past that Cincinnati game. So I know he could change plays because he canned multiple calls multiple times. In that Eagles game alone, he canned at least 3 calls. And I remember him doing it against Baltimore too, the playoff game. So that's a basic one, though. I mean, every quarterback in the NFL has the ability to can calls and change them. So there's always 2 or 3 calls built into plays. Just so you guys know, usually within a play itself, there is the main play called, and then if you get a certain look, you can it, right? And you go to this second play. So oftentimes plays can have 2 different plays in a play call. And so all of these different things kind of come into each other. And it's like, I don't think that Russ and Arthur Smith had this like glimmering, shiny relationship, where they were skipping in the meadow together as best friends. I don't think that's necessarily what it was. I also don't necessarily think, though, that Russ was completely sabotaged, if you will. Here's the thing. Russ has always been the type of quarterback that kind of drives an offensive coordinator insane. He is a guy that likes to play backyard football in a lot of ways. He likes to run around, make plays that way. He takes bad sacks. doesn't always see things in structure, doesn't throw over the middle of the field, largely because he can't see the middle of the field. And so there's just things where you dial a play as a play caller, and Russ is just not going to execute it completely. And what Arthur Smith did before Pittsburgh and what Russ did before Pittsburgh are basically at odds with one another. Russ is a deep ball thrower down the sideline. He likes to throw outside the numbers, the check downs, deep ball guy. When you look at what Arthur Smith is, he's an under center, play action, zone, middle of the field, heavy offense. He likes the intermediate portions of the field. Russ never throws to the middle intermediate of the field unless it is up the seams. That's the only place he really throws. And so, I read over Jerry's report, and Jerry Dulac kind of says, it started a little bit at that Bengals game. I'm going to say that it probably didn't happen directly after that. I'm assuming it happened at some point during that losing streak. My guess is it would be after the Kansas City game, because we've kind of been told that pick that Wilson threw to Pat Freiermuth was a little bit of improvisation. It wasn't necessarily drawn up that way. My guess is it was at some point in that kind of area where that's when that happened, and Wilson lost a little bit of freedom. Justin Fields never had the freedom at the line of scrimmage, for what it's worth. All Justin Fields could do was can calls. He couldn't change a route, couldn't change a stem, couldn't do any of that stuff. So he didn't really have a lot of freedom at the line of scrimmage. But I think, when you take Russ's ability to do things like that away, I do think it takes away one part of what makes Russ Russ. Why do you have Russ? He's a veteran that sees the field a little differently than a young guy, and he's able to change things like that. He's able to see this matchup and kind of ad-lib it, if you will. And so I think taking that away from Russ does hurt you a little bit. And so it's weird, man. Russ definitely didn't play well down the stretch. There's no doubt about it. But, if you're looking for who was the problem or whatever, I mean, it's not an either-or situation. Arthur Smith and Russell Wilson, I've talked about it multiple times on here about both these guys. I think they were part of a problem. I don't think they were both the problem, but they were a problem of a bigger issue. But regardless, I think it's pretty clear that these two, it never made sense from the jump, right? When Russ signed last March, if you do anything about Arthur Smith's scheme, Russ is not really an Arthur Smith quarterback. He doesn't really fit what Arthur Smith does super well. And so it made complete sense that they were kind of at odds with one another, and Arthur Smith kind of tweaked his scheme to fit Russ in ways, but it also depends on how much was taken away. Was he able to change play calls completely before it was taken away? And so there's a lot of nuance and pre-snap ability for a quarterback. So just because, someone says, hey, the pre-snap abilities were kind of taken away, it's, well, what was taken away? What was still there? Because, again, he was able to can calls the entire time. So depends.
It seemed like the crux wasn't, and you framed it perfectly, the philosophy. Smith had the run-first philosophy where apparently, reading between the lines, Wilson was checking out of runs and going to passes. You know what I mean? And that running game never really did get untracked. But apparently Smith was, adamant, sticking to it. Now, there was one line in the article, because it almost seemed like the conventional wisdom in Pittsburgh is that, the Steelers have turned the page on Russ and are going to sign Justin Fields, almost like it's a fait accompli. But this story from Dulac has this line: there is a sentiment in the organization to bring back the 10-time Pro Bowl quarterback who will be 37 in November, because they saw what the offense was capable of in his first 7 starts. But part of the process will be making sure Wilson and Smith can work together and not butt heads over how the offense should operate. In other words, this report makes it seem like Wilson is the favorite to get re-signed as long as they can work out this wrinkle in offensive philosophies. What do you make of that?
That's a big if. That's what I would say. And listen, Russ does have options. I mean, I think if he hits the market, I do think the Raiders are going to be interested in it. Makes sense. Pete Carroll's there. They need a quarterback. They need a bridge at least, even if they decide to get a young guy this year. And so here's the other thing that I thought was interesting. Jerry Dulac stating that Russ is going to get between $20 and $25 million. Oof. I would not give him that much money. That's not cumulatively, by the way. That is average per year. So that's a multi-year deal, probably like a 2-year, $44 million deal. That's a hefty contract, I think, for what we saw this year there. And so I think it's interesting because, listen, I've heard many things that the Steelers are quite comfortable with Justin Fields as their starter. I think there's another camp in the building that thinks that Russ's 7 games, where he did go 6-1 and was playing at a high level, that can be what they are. But I also think that there's a lot of people that in that organization that just saw Russ as a limited quarterback. And I think, Arthur Smith kind of sees the way his offense wants to be ran and what Russ does. And again, it's just so different. They're just drastically different passing games. And so I wonder, but Justin Fields coming back, I don't think should be any less likely than when we talked about it. I do think that the Steelers are negotiating with both. I don't think that they are going to. I'm not even sure there's a huge preference here because, as I'm telling you, like it feels like there are like factions in the organization. Like this side likes Justin, this side likes Russ, and it's kind of all over the place. And so, whichever way they go, it's whatever more cost efficient. Who's going to agree to the deal first, and where they kind of see this as. And so, I don't know. I think it's where it's going to play out. Does Russ want between 20 and 25 or does he want 30? I mean, I think that's a very real possibility. Does Russ want 30 a year? That's a real possibility. Does Justin, we've been talking about Justin Fields wanting 10. Does Justin want 15 to 20? I mean, there's all these factors. And so when you're negotiating with 2 quarterbacks and you have this situation here, you kind of got to ride the line, right? Because if you say publicly, think of it this way, there's 2 ways to look at it. The one way is, yes, Russ is going to be more likely to come back if they clear this hurdle. Again, it's a big hurdle when your play caller and quarterback aren't completely aligned with one another. So that's a big hurdle. So either Smith's going to have to crack or Russ is going to have to crack. We'll see if that happens. The second way to look at it is, well, the Steelers can't exactly say Russ is going to leave. We don't really want him back because then Justin Fields has all the leverage in a negotiation and can drive up that price. And forbid this if you were being truthful with that. You were saying, well, we don't want Russ back. And then Justin Fields doesn't get the number he wants. And Lord forbid he hit the market and went elsewhere and you missed on both of them.
Yeah.
I mean, that you know what I mean? Like, that is a scenario you can ride there. So the Steelers have to keep both options open. They have to see which is the most cost effective for the play that they view. And that's why you're seeing this kind of straddle the line thing. So I think that there's a camp in the organization that wants Justin. I think there's a camp that wants Russ. It's just going to kind of come down to contract dynamics and personal dynamics to see which one is better.
And speaking of those factions within the building, there was that other Pryor report that I mentioned that was unfavorable to Wilson by Brooke Pryor, one of your colleagues in the locker room. And they were talking about his play in practices late in the year when obviously this losing streak was playing out, calling it exceedingly poor. Quote, he did not look good. He was making mistakes. He was throwing picks, and that was in practice. And then, of course, you had this string of losses. But my question again is, okay, if Wilson is stinking it up in practice, if he's losing games, the offensive production was obviously down. Why didn't they go back to Justin Fields? Especially if there's a faction that think he can be the starter next year.
Well, Mike Tomlin, I think, very publicly has been pro Russell Wilson. I think that is very clear. He said he went Lone Ranger on the decision. Remember that? Mm-hmm. So there were people in the organization, even when Russ was inserted, that just wanted to keep riding with Justin Fields. And listen, it's like not that uncommon to have these types of factions in situations like that in the NFL. When you have one quarterback versus the other, there's often people on the staff that feel one way versus the other. So I'm not saying there's like dysfunction and discord on the South side. It's on South Water Street right now. This is pretty common. And so when you look at this, Russ in a lot of ways was a guy that came in with this veteran presence. That came in with this leadership. He had been through the rocky moments. I think Mike Tomlin just really values that. He values experience. He values, Super Bowl winning pedigree. He values what Russ brought to the offense because he felt that Russ's explosiveness with his moon ball can open up the offense more. And listen, Justin Fields has some pretty similar issues to Russ. Now, it's his reasons for why they are issues are different, but Justin Fields is an inconsistent thrower to the intermediate part of the middle of the field. He flashes it sometimes, but he doesn't always do it. He's less accurate deep. He gives you the legs, obviously. He gives you the ability to work a quarterback run game and the scramble. So very different players on different sides of the spectrum. But I just think it's the veteran presence that Mike Tomlin rides with a lot, and he trusts Russell Wilson to get them through that. And so I think that's why. I think that's why Justin Fields wasn't inserted back in. And so I think, when you see how that went the last 5 games, I do think, though, for Mike Tomlin, it also changes some things where it's like, I believed in Russ heavily. Maybe this needs to change a little bit, though. So we will see. I right now, I would still lean towards Fields being the quarterback next year, personally. But certainly neither door is closed on both these guys.
I think that was a great way to put it. The fact that you got to have both of them in play, because otherwise, once you signal that one is out of the running, the other guy has all the leverage in the contract talks. And I can understand, and certainly any the Roethlisberger era. I mean, Tomlin enjoyed a veteran Super Bowl winning quarterback that made him a contender year after year. The team, even though we did have that playoff drive spell in the latter years of Ben. So you understand why he would tend to gravitate to a Wilson. So that's easy to see. But like you said, the ending, the bad ending, certainly gives you pause, and certainly must trigger Tomlin to really evaluate the trajectory for Wilson and Fields going into 2025. And speaking of 2025, you have channeled your inner Omar Khan. You've taken everything that you observed down in Mobile, and you've come up with your 1.0 mock draft. First of all, talk about your philosophy, how you do this, why you do this, and what does this give the casual fan who's going to watch the draft and root for the Steelers and think they got all the best players in the draft just because they're going to be wearing Steeler uniform? What can we glean from this as average fans?
Well, I very much believe the team has a very real possibility of going defensive line in the first round. That's what I heard at the Senior Bowl. We talked about that last week when I was down there. That was the first indication when Mike Tomlin was hawking those defensive linemen all week. They continued to do that all week. Receiver was the other one. And so I feel like their top 2 needs that they are going to try and address are going to be defensive line and wide receiver. I think a double dip at defensive line is very possible. Hence why I double dipped at defensive line in that draft. I'm kind of just getting to know names still, right? So some of those names down the draft board, even in the middle rounds, are just kind of guys that fit that mold, fit that kind of checkerboard. We'll see where the specific names come up. I do think Kenneth Grant is a really interesting name for them because he's a 342-pound man that's 6'3", moves freakishly for his size, and probably plays at nose tackle, and can work out to 3-tech as well. So he's an interesting player. But I mean, things that we have talked about on here: defensive line in the first round, wide receiver, probably a vet receiver coming at some point in the free agency process. I still think they draft one potentially in the middle rounds. We have that middle round running back coming in there. I think a guy like Bashil Tutin, who I mocked to them in this mock, that zone runner with speed that can hit the gas. Really intriguing target. There's a few other guys I could think of that I thought of, guys like Dylan Sampson, Travion Henderson, Devin Neal, similar to that. I also think it also shows no quarterbacks until the 7th round. Now, they can go with the quarterback probably as early as the 3rd round. Depends on, Will Howard, Jackson Dart, where some of those guys fall, Kyle McCord. But I don't really expect one super early in this draft. I don't expect one earlier than that 3rd round, so that's another thing. And, I think it went under the radar, but Art Rooney, when he does his press tour, does interviews with all three TV stations in the Pittsburgh market: WTAE, WPXI, and KDKA. And when he talked with WTAE, he was basically asked what he viewed as the top needs. He named 4 needs: defensive line, wide receiver, running back, and corner. I mean, that's the focus of this draft, I think. It's going to be the focus of free agency. I don't think that they necessarily have a 100% concrete plan of which ones they're going to try and fill in free agency. I think it's going to come down to numbers. I think they want to have a receiver before the NFL draft. I think they're probably going to sign a corner probably before the NFL draft, and they'll probably sign a defensive lineman too. But I do think when you look at it, those are the 4 things. So that's, the first 4 picks in this draft that I did were D-line, wide receiver, corner, and running back. And I think that has a very real chance of playing out like that. Not necessarily always in that order, too. I mean, it depends on who's there. But I do think those, top 4 rounds could definitely be D-line, receiver, corner, running back in some order and fashion.
No, I think you nailed it. And Rooney, and even in these past few drafts, the Steelers are pretty transparent in signaling what they're going to do. There used to be a lot of head faking. They don't try to do that as much anymore. But yet, as you mentioned, and of course, the full mock is on PennLive, but we're going to talk about some of the notable picks here. You did say you had Kenneth Grant out of Michigan going to the Steelers at pick 21. What makes him a Steeler versus other options at that same position that that they players they were looking at the Senior Bowl, and obviously through their scouting? What makes him versus and was there a close second in your mind at that pick?
Yeah, I keep going back and forth. Grant, though, one, I saw Mike Tomlin talking with the Michigan defensive line coach significantly, and I've just heard Grant's name pop up a few times with the Steelers. So that kind of little interest I heard kind of separates him. But when you turn on the tape, you see it. They talk about stopping the run. Great run stuff he's athletic, high motor, high character. He checks off a lot of boxes for a first-round pick for the Steelers. And the one thing I'm a little bit tentative about, I mock Grant to the Steelers, and I think he has pass rush upside, but the pass rush plan is not really there yet. And the Steelers have focused a lot on pass rush upside in their defensive linemen. Keanu Benton, Montravius Adams, Larry Ogunjobi. Pass rush upside, maybe sacrificing some run defense. And so that's my one thing. Do they kind of slant back the other way, which is what this would signal, or do they go with more of a pass rusher? And I think that they, it's not a bad defensive tackle free agency crop. There are nose tackles to be had, and if you sign a nose tackle, I mean, I just think it's that guy and Montravius Adams, and you're kind of okay. And then you can draft a 5-tech. So there's other guys here, Walter Nolan and Derek Harmon, who are those 5-techs and can be Cam Hayward replacements. I think that's what I'm kind of debating. Do they want a nose that can plug the run early, or do they want the Cam Hayward mentee, right? That's kind of the thing. Keanu Benton's one of the Cam Hayward mentees, and I've talked about it on here how I believe they're going to try and kick Keanu Benton out of the nose. I think they're going to try and put him out to 3 and 5-tech, where he's probably more comfortable and where his skill set fits more. And so I can see them signing a veteran nose and going out and getting this 5-tech Cam Hayward-like player. So Derek Harmon or Walter Nolan would make sense in that view. But Grant just has a lot of Steelersy traits, from the pedigree to the fact that he played in big games, to the fact that he's a run plugger, to the fact that he can probably play out to as much as a 3-tech, so he's not just sub-package. He's not out of sub-package football. He can play there. I think he has a lot of similarities to DJ Reader when you watch him on tape. He's inconsistent at times, but the high-level flashes are there. And so, Grant feels like a Steelers because Steelers have drafted a lot of players like that. Broderick Jones was super, super, super raw, but had these flashes. Obviously, that pick hasn't worked out as well. But, that's something they love. They love traits. They love athleticism. And they want a run plugger. I mean, it's either him or Tyleik Williams, one of those two, that fits that mold. But if they're looking for a 5-tech, there's options there too. Harmon and Nolan both make sense as well. And so we'll kind of see where that falls. That's going to be something that I'm going to try and pick up on as much as I can when I go to the combine and throughout free agency. But that will be very, very important to watch. So the type of defensive lineman they want early. If they are just looking exclusively as nose tackles, I gotta wonder if they maybe wait on defensive line. I know that I've talked about how they've looked at defensive line heavily and how it sure seemed like they were talking, potential first round defensive linemen like Walter Nolan down in Mobile. But I will say, if they want a nose run plugger, I mean, you can get those in the second and third round. So if you're looking at that, maybe you'd rather take a Mecca Egbuka or Matthew Gold. We'll see.
Yeah, and it's a great point. This mock is coming out. We don't know what dominoes are going to fall in free agency. We're going to see who really rises up the chart at the combine. So there's a lot of unknown variables. But the variable that you put in the story to justify taking Kenneth Grant is the two dominant performances by Derrick Henry against that Steelers D line that could not stop him, and that was reason enough to put him at pick 21. We go to the second round, pick 52, where the Steelers do have a long history of taking a wide receiver, and you give him Jack Bech out of TCU. And there's a lot of other receivers, being tied to the Steelers, maybe bigger names. But why this player from TCU in the second round as a wide receiver to the Steelers? What makes him a Steeler for 2025?
Man, tough kid, high character, great blocker, but not just kind of put into a box. I think that is the big thing. He is a guy that can play in the inside or play outside, so he can play anywhere from X to big slot to Z. I don't think he's going to be the twitchiest athlete you'll ever see. He'll probably run 4.55, so he's not going to be a guy that's an athletic freak. But he does everything solid. He's got great hands. He has a great catch point focus. He's got really good catch radius. He can go up and make plays above the rim. He's got physicality that gives him some yak. You're going to see a lot of comps to Puka Nacua here, and it makes a lot of sense because he fits that similar mold. And so Bech is a really fun player. They kind of rocketed up boards. I think coming into Mobile, he was a fringe third, fourth rounder. Now I think he's the opposite. I think he's a fringe second, third rounder. I think he's a really solid player. And he's a guy getting a ton of buzz. He just does the little things well. He's just a football player. And so when you look at guys you really want in your offense, and specifically an offense like Arthur Smith's, which is a LaFleur inspired one, it's an offshoot of the McVay offense that really values wide receiver blocking, a guy like Bech feels very Steelersy in that regard. And so he makes a lot of sense for them if they don't have a guy that fills that role by that time.
All right. And because this is such a key position, and it was such a deficiency last year, and Omar Khan took a lot of heat because he left the Steelers high and dry in the receiver room. Are there any other big names that you feel could be a Steeler in 2025? And is there any argument, because this is such a position of need and we need elite players on offense, is there any argument that they do something in the first round rather than the second round at this position? And who would some of the other names to be on our radar to watch out for at receiver?
Certainly, there's a chance they go wide receiver, and they're in the honey hole of receivers in the first round. So they probably don't have a shot at Teteroa McMillan, who is probably the undisputed wide receiver one in this class. He will probably go top 10, top 15 for sure, but I don't think there's another guy that is like not 100% going to make it. Luther Burden, Emeka Egbuka, and Matthew Golden all have chances to make it to the Steelers. Out of those three, I actually really like Matthew Golden. He's an outside receiver. He's got great route running. He's going to test like an absolute freak. Egbuka, I think, is a little more slot specific. I think Burden, size-wise is probably slot specific, but I think he's quick and twitchy enough that you can get him outside snaps too. I think Egbuka is quick and explosive enough to get outside snaps, but Golden is more of a true outside guy. Burden and Egbuka are probably going to be inside-out players, and so I think all three guys are really good options for them. So there's absolutely an option they go first round wide receiver because they have talents here. And definitely, I think they can fall in love with any of these three guys, and so I would say defensive line or wide receiver in the first round. We'll see where that ends up going. I also think if they don't take Besh in the second round, there are some other names. Ty Felton from Maryland. Maryland wide receiver. There's connections there. He did play with Dino Tomlin, so he knows Mike Tomlin. But this guy is explosive. He's a great ball tracker. This specifically, if Russell Wilson comes back, Ty Felton is a Steelers-y player for a moonball type of offense. He goes up and wins above the rim. He's probably going to run in the 4.3s. He's just a burner. He's got great ball tracking, so even if Russ is off on some of the moonballs, he goes up and makes great plays. He makes quarterbacks look good. He's got great body control, and he's an outside guy. And so if Russell Wilson comes back, Ty Felton in the third round might be the Steelers' play there because he really fits what they do. And so that's a name to keep an eye on. There are other names. Savion Williams from TCU, the other TCU receiver. He's 6'5". He's kind of blurring the lines. You know, he's kind of a receiver. He's kind of a running back maybe. He's just a ball catcher. He'll probably get, comps all across the board. He'll get comps to Laviska Shenault. He'll probably get, even though he's 6'5" compared to Deebo Samuel's 5'11", 6 feet, he'll probably get Deebo Samuel comps. I kind of liken him to Cordero Patterson, who the Steelers obviously have on their roster, so they'll probably be interested in him if Cordero Patterson leaves, which I do think he will. And so there are some names. It's not a super deep class, but there are guys. I really look at Ty Felton as a real sleeper name no one's giving enough attention to when it comes to the Steelers as just a good fit for the offense in general. Then you add in the personal connection. It clicks a little bit. So third round for Ty Felton, who I think is a really solid player, could really be a sleeper option for the Steelers. Circle him in your mid-round boards.
Right. As for the mock draft 1.0 in the mid-round, pick 85, round 3, you have Denzel Burke, cornerback out of Ohio State, penciled in for the black and gold. What makes him a Steeler and what makes him useful in that secondary that definitely needs some help?
Yeah, he's just a guy I've heard the Steelers like. I got to be real with you. I don't really love the film personally, but if I'm trying to predict who they're going to pick, if I hear some buzz about a guy at Steelers for this one, I'm just getting little whispers, so I'm throwing them in there. There are other guys here that I'd rather have, like a Kobe Bryant. If it's R.A. Thomas falls this far, I don't think he will, but definitely him. There's a lot of players. Quincy Riley that could fit in here as well. Burke, comes from Ohio State, so he's a high pedigree player. The Steelers love these guys that come from powerhouse schools, powerhouse conferences. He's probably going to test really well. 6 feet, 193 with good length, and he plays physical in the run game. So there's a lot of things that they like there that I'm sure they'll like. He'll probably be an outside-in guy. He could probably smoke into the slot a little bit. I think there are better players, but Burke is probably going to go third round just because of his pedigree and where he played. His end of the season was also quite good in the playoffs. Had a really good game against Oregon. Played pretty well against Notre Dame as well. So that boosted his stock. A lot of these Ohio State players probably boosted their stock with that playoff run they had in the national championship. So I do think Burke is a name that I would like to see them go away from, but I have heard some whispers that they like this guy. So, and I see the Steelers traits here for Denzel Burke. So that's kind of what makes him a Steelers-y player. I would go in another direction, but we'll see.
Hey, I mean, when you're getting the whispers and your sources are saying the name, that's the first duty of a mock is to try to be predicting what the team is going to do, not what you would want them to do. So you are right on point with penciling him in the third round. Now you have the Steelers waiting till round 4, pick 122 for a running back, even though it's a fait accompli. We know Najee Harris is gone, and get this, he's going to make $10 million a year. That's supposedly his value on the free agency market. So, to him, I mean, he's gonna be rolling in it. And I'm gonna butcher the name. You have, give me the name out of Virginia Tech who you have going to be the running back, supposedly tandem now with Warren. And and what makes him the new dimension of the running game that Arthur Smith needs to have to redeem himself, because he's a running offensive coordinator, and we did not run well in 2025. So how does this pick redeem Arthur Smith?
Well, I think they want speed. That's another thing I've been told. They want speed at the running back position. Because Jalen Warren,
Say his name again.
Bashal Tootin is how you say it.
Bashal Tootin. Okay.
So Bashal Tootin is a really fun player. He is a absolute speed demon. I mean, he hits one cut, gets through the hole, and if you don't touch him, he's gone. Highly productive zone running back. Really fun player. Not much receiving production. For one, that Virginia Tech offense kind of sucked in a lot of respects, and Tootin was a lot of what made their offense go when he was cooking. But when he follows his line, he's patient enough, and he's this one-cut outside zone runner that they kind of think they need, I believe. Now, there are other guys in this class that fit what Tootin does, but Tootin also is way better in pass pro than I thought he was. He could really kind of pass protect. They had backs on backers drill. I think he was the best one of that drill. He's about 5'9", 205. So he's densely built, kind of like Jalen Warren, right? Jalen Warren's about 5'8", 210. There are some similarities in their game, but Tootin's way faster. And I think Warren is kind of more physical and bounces off guys a little bit easier. So they're different players in that regard. But I do look at Tootin and say, this is the kind of guy, this is the angle breaker type of guy they look at. But there are other options. Dylan Sampson, Travion Henderson, Devin Neal, Caleb Johnson, if they want to go really early. There's just different running backs in this class that have the speed element, but Tootin kind of brings together some nice things. And I also really like the profile production that he brings to the table. In the fourth round, I think he's a really solid player. In most drafts, I think Tootin would be a day 2 player. It's just such a deep running back class. There are 30, 35 draftable running backs in this class, so he's going to get pushed down a little bit. This is the type of value pick that you make at that position, especially when you need it and he wants to.
Hey, all I have to say to that is you're darn tootin'. No, that was terrible. That was terrible. But for the rest of that was bad. The rest of this mock draft, you're going to have to go to PennLive to check it out. We're out of time for this week, a late Tuesday edition of your Steelers Breakdown podcast. Be here next week when we'll get deeper into the offseason and what's coming change-wise. And there's going to be a lot of them, player-wise, obviously, for the Steelers. Free agency, we'll start looking all that stuff. So be here next Tuesday for the big show. Go Steelers.